I lived a life that made sense. That's the easiest way to describe it. If someone asked me to explain my choices, I could. There was always a reason, a practical one, a reasonable one. Nothing was random, nothing was reckless, nothing was obviously wrong. Each step followed the previous one in a way that felt logical. I did what worked, what was expected, what fit the situation I was in. And because it all made sense, I rarely questioned it. Sense became my compass. Not desire, not curiosity, not even doubt. Just sense. This job made sense. This schedule made sense. This version of my life made sense, given everything that came before it. And for a long time, that felt like enough. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't lost. I wasn't unhappy in any dramatic way. From the outside, my life looked stable. From the inside, it felt organized. I knew what my days would look like. I knew what was required of me. I knew how to keep things running. That predictability was comforting. It reduced friction. It reduced uncertainty. It reduced questions that didn't have clear answers. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what it meant to build a life instead of chasing one. And maybe that was true. But something subtle was missing. Not excitement, not passion, alignment. I didn't feel disconnected from my life. I felt slightly adjacent to it, as if I was standing just to the side, watching myself live it competently. I noticed it in moments that didn't match their importance, when something went well and I acknowledged it without feeling much, when something ended and I moved on easily, almost too easily, when I thought about the future and felt neutral instead of curious. Nothing hurt. That's what made it confusing. We're taught to notice pain, to respond to crisis, to change when things break. But what do you do when nothing breaks? When life works, but doesn't quite resonate? I had built a life that functioned efficiently. It made sense on paper. It made sense in conversation. But it didn't always feel like it belonged to me. I realized that making sense and feeling right are not the same thing. They overlap, but they're not identical. A life can be sensible and still feel distant. A choice can be logical and still feel misaligned. I had chosen what was reasonable over what was felt, not because I ignored myself, but because I trusted reason more. Reason was safer. It could be explained. It could be defended. Feelings were vague, uncertain, harder to justify. So I learned to prioritize what could be justified. I built my life the way you build something durable, with structure, with planning, with minimal risk. And it held together. But durability is not the same as liveliness. I didn't feel trapped. That's important. I felt settled. And settlement can quietly replace intention if you're not paying attention. I stopped asking myself whether this life reflected me. I only asked whether it worked. And it did. Until I noticed how often I was operating on autopilot, how rarely I checked in with how something actually felt, how often I told myself, "This is fine," without asking, "But is it mine?" I had learned to measure success by stability, by consistency, by predictability. Those are not bad measures, but they're incomplete. They don't tell you whether you recognize yourself inside the life you've built. I realized that I had been living reactively even while appearing intentional, responding to circumstances, adjusting to constraints, optimizing within boundaries I never consciously chose. The life that made sense was also the life that asked the least from me emotionally. It didn't demand reflection, it didn't demand courage, it didn't demand risk. It simply continued. And continuation is easy to mistake for choice. I thought that because I hadn't resisted, I must have agreed. But compliance and agreement are not the same thing. I had complied with momentum, with expectations, with timing, with the logic of this is how things go. And momentum is persuasive. It doesn't pressure you. It doesn't rush you. It just carries you forward while everything feels acceptable. I didn't resent my life. I didn't regret my choices. I just noticed how little I felt involved in them, how rarely I felt consulted by my own decisions. I realized that sense had replaced listening. I listened to circumstances, to practicality, to what seemed appropriate. But I hadn't listened much to my internal responses, not because they were loud, but because they were subtle. They didn't interrupt, they didn't insist. They faded into the background while I focused on what worked. I understood then why nothing felt urgent, why nothing demanded change. Because a life that makes sense doesn't create friction. It doesn't force a decision. It allows you to keep going without ever asking whether going is the right direction. That realization didn't come with panic, it came with clarity, a quiet understanding that I had mistaken coherence for alignment. I had assumed that because my life was consistent, it must be correct. But correctness is a poor substitute for connection. I didn't need to dismantle my life. That idea felt extreme. I didn't need to reject the choices I had made. They were honest, given what I knew at the time. What I needed was attention. I needed to start noticing where this makes sense and this feels right diverged. Those moments were small. They didn't announce themselves. A slight resistance, a muted enthusiasm, a sense of distance that didn't rise to discomfort. I had ignored those signals for years because they didn't seem important enough, but they were consistent, and consistency matters. I began to see that living a sensible life had taught me how to avoid mistakes, but not how to recognize myself. I had optimized for safety, not for presence. And presence cannot be reasoned into existence. It has to be felt. I didn't stop valuing logic. I didn't abandon structure. I simply stopped letting them be the only voices in the room. I allowed space for uncertainty, for hesitation, for feelings that didn't come with a clear explanation. I didn't act on them immediately. I just acknowledged them. That alone changed how my life felt, not dramatically, not visibly, but internally. The life I lived still made sense. But now it didn't have to be the final argument. I began to understand that sense is a foundation, not a destination. It supports a life. It doesn't define it. A life that only makes sense can slowly become a life you maintain instead of inhabit. I hadn't failed. I hadn't chosen wrong. I had simply stopped asking whether this life still belonged to me. And that question, once noticed, doesn't go away. It doesn't demand an answer right away. It just asked to be included. I didn't suddenly know what I wanted. I didn't uncover a hidden truth, but I stopped assuming that a life that made sense was automatically a life that was right for me. That shift didn't change everything, but it changed how I paid attention. And attention, quiet as it is often where real alignment begins.